Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar session as part of the EU Values webinar series. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator. This webinar is hosted by the EU Values Network, which is a collaborative Jean Monnet initiative. So if you like today's session or indeed any of our work, we'd be very grateful if you could follow and subscribe to us on any of our social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, many things. So just go head to our website and you'll find everything there. And yeah, we really appreciate that and your support. Now on to today's session. The Russia-Ukraine war has reshaped global security and raised some very pressing questions about the resilience of the Transatlantic Alliance. And in this webinar, we're pleased to welcome Professor Lorenzo Cladi, author of Transatlantic Relations After the Russian-Ukrainian War, which was published by Routledge this year. Despite ongoing debates over European strategic autonomy and shifting US priorities, there is considerable concern that Europe remains fundamentally dependent on US security guarantees. I'm sure this is something that we'll hear more about in today's presentation. And Lorenzo is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Plymouth, where he teaches and supervises on NATO, international security, and European foreign policy. He's previously held posts at the University of Birmingham, Bath, Loughborough, and St. Bonaventure University in New York as well. And joining him is our expert discussant, Professor Adrian Hyde-Price of the University of Gothenburg, a leading scholar in European security and international relations theory, who will provide expert commentary and reflections on Lorenzo's work as well. And so together, Professor Cladi and Professor Hyde-Price, they'll help us to understand the dynamics of transatlantic relations in this particular quite significant time we find ourselves in. So, well, thank you both for today's session. If you're watching this live at home or wherever you are, you will have the opportunity at the end to ask any questions you want in the Q&A box as well. Well, that's enough for me. I will now hand over to Professor Lorenzo Cladi for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, let's do the slideshow. Great. I trust, oh, the video's gone.
No, you're good. You can go.
I trust you can see the slides.
Yes, all good.
Okay, and there we go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much, Emily, Adam, for organizing this. Thank you to Professor Hyde-Price for accepting the invitation to discuss the book. And thank you all so much for taking out the time to come and listen to this webinar. So this is based on my new book, Transatlantic Relations After the Russian-Ukrainian War, a Neo-realist Approach. I am Lorenzo Cladi and I work at the University of Plymouth in southwest England. What I'm going to talk to you about, well, firstly, I would like to say a little bit about the aim of the book, what I intend to achieve with the book. Then I'm going to spend a little bit talking about what it actually means in 2025 to adopt a neo-realist approach to the matter. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my neo-realist approach. I'm going to tell you something, but I will not tell you everything because I kind of like people to actually read the book if possible, but hopefully I will get you to at least think about reading this book. All right, then I'll finish off by telling you about the book structure and I'm going to make a concluding statement. This is a book about transatlantic relations. So by that, I mean broadly the relationship between the United States and its European counterparts, so its European allies. It's not just about NATO as such, but I take a broader approach to transatlantic relations, meaning the entire world of the relationship between the transatlantic allies. What sparked my interest and my drive really for writing this book was thinking about transatlantic relations in times of global crisis, but global crisis of really quick succession, surprisingly, scaringly quick succession. We obviously were talking so much about COVID-19. That was the global crisis between 2020 and 2022. And then almost overnight, we moved from COVID-19 to the Russian-Ukrainian war. Experts changed, commentary on TV changed, commentary on social media changed, our perceptions changed, our discussion points changed almost pretty much overnight. And by March 2022, a lot of the talk on COVID-19 seemed fairly vintage. And what does that mean essentially for transatlantic relations? How do we assess the strength of the relationship in times of global crisis in really, really quick succession? This is what the book is about. Now, what I want to do with this book, I want to debate, I want to contribute to debate. I am not going to say what I say is the one that is right. I would just like to contribute to debate. And I think we should bring some debate back to IR. I note sometimes regrettably that in recent years IR has gone more and more parochial, and people tend to sit very much in silos and not really debate with each other. But I would like to contribute to this debate. And I still think that the theories of international relations, and in particular the big debate between realism and liberalism, still provides the basis, at least the basis for this type of debate. What I do, I bring one possible perspective to the debate, using neo-realism to shed light upon transatlantic relations was a lodestar from me. For me, I was not interested in watering down realism. A lot of people do that, mix realism with liberalism, realism with social constructivism, realism with this, realism with that, to have a more complete picture, so to speak. I wasn't interested in doing that, and I wasn't interested in using IR theory as a box ticking exercise, which again is something that is regrettably done these days. I wanted to go all the way in terms of seeing what neo-realism really could bring now to transatlantic relations. And let me take this point home. I very much agree with the social scientist, psychologist Karl Popper here. The aim of argument should not be victory, but progress. If I can get people to engage with the topic and approach of the book, and perhaps offer an alternative viewpoint, then I think we will have achieved something good with this book. All right, progress. Not necessarily putting one argument over another, but fruitful debate, and bring that back to international relations higher theory. Now I have to tell you what is this neo-realist approach that I advocate in this book. Neo-realism as such used to be a dominant theory in international relations, particularly from the 1980s and onwards. It was still part pretty much of debates in the 1990s, but then it started to lose its status, so to speak, as a dominant theory in international relations. And neo-realism, a pure version of neo-realism, so to speak, tended to be particularly dominant in North America. It had and still has some followers in Europe, but predominantly in North America. But it is definitely not dominant anymore in international relations. In fact, it gets vilified quite often by people that are not realist scholars, use essentially neo-realism as what not to do, what not to say in order to embellish their own approach. All right, but that's where we are. So this is the neo-realist approach. This is the way we start. Neo-realism tends to put a lot of importance, a lot of emphasis upon balance of power considerations. It is a systemic theory, and we talk about balance of power and their effects upon state behavior. And what's key is how states think about advancing their own interest, how they calculate what's in their best interest, considering balance of power consideration. So it's still a top-down theory. It's not bottom-up. It is very much a top-down approach. With neo-realism, we are interested in parsimony. We are interested in doing a lot with very little. All right? For some people, that's a way to doing things incompletely. So the incomplete way, because you leave so many things out of the equation. But for neo-realists, doing a lot with very few variables means that you're doing the right thing, because you are interested in explaining state-to-state relations. You start from balance of power considerations, and what you're interested in catching the bigger picture, so to speak, of state-to-state relations. What does it mean to adopt a neo-realist approach nowadays? I kept thinking about this over and over and over when I was researching for this book, and especially when I was writing the theoretical chapter, chapter 2. It means that you are an underdog, essentially, all right? Nobody really thinks that neo-realism is worth much these days. So you are actually working harder in order to prove that you still have a lot of things to say if you use neo-realism. So it means pretty much being an underdog. It means that you are challenged in many different ways. In the 1980s, neo-realist scholars were mainly debating with the neoliberal institutionalist scholars. Then in the 1990s, they were mainly debating with the social constructivist scholars. These days, you are actually debating with the liberalists, social constructivists, post-structuralists, post-colonialists, feminists, all the peace studies. There's been a proliferation of approaches in the discipline, and they all pretty much start from saying neo-realism is wrong, I am right because. So you have to take that into account if you adopt a neo-realist approach as well. And you gotta be creative, all right? The creative process is still really important because although neo-realist scholars tend to start from similar assumptions, they develop different explanations. All right, so I have created my own, and there is the issue of being creative. And when you write a monograph, it is pretty much your burden to be creative and to try to produce something. Okay, but if you love IR, which I do, then it's less daunting, though it is obviously a pretty daunting thing to do, being intellectually creative with theories. And you gotta believe in your own line of thinking, your own argument. Okay, so that's what really propels you forward, especially when you write a monograph. And academics in the audience will know all too well that these days carving out the time to do your own research is getting more and more challenging. So you really need a very, very strong lodestar, a very, very strong drive to write a monograph and adopt a theoretical approach in a monograph. If you're not the one that believes in it, then unfortunately it's not going to write itself by itself. All right. So that's really important as well in adopting this type of approach. Okay. So what does my neo-realist approach entail? I start from five assumptions in a certain order. All right. States are the most important actors in the international system. That's a very important one. Yes, international institutions are important, but nowhere near as important as states and their own interests in the international system. Number two, states are unitary actors. Yes, absolutely. There's many different actors that can say we speak on behalf of the state, but when it comes to security, states will tend to speak with one voice. And that's a very important assumption as well for my neo-realist approach. Third, survival is really important. And because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's times of global crisis in very quick succession. We have been drawn, even people that did not really believe in neo-realism have been drawn to really reconsider how important survival is in the international system when in times of global crisis, it cannot necessarily be taken for granted. So I think that assumption is particularly valid in this day and age, and the fundamental aim is for states to survive. Number four, international system is anarchic. Okay, this is a very familiar neo-realist assumption, and essentially states have to rely on self-help. They have only got themselves to worry about, and it's very important that they look after their own security, their own interest in the international system, because if they get into trouble, there is no one that can save them. And number five, last but not least, security is scarce. There is competition for security. Okay? And because security is scarce, states have to be extra careful with what they do. The system, in my understanding of neo-realism, the system does not reward reckless behavior. All right, it's very important to be extra careful with what you do in the international system. There is security, but not for all, and it can be taken away from you if you're not careful. All right, so that's what my neo-realist approach entails. Five assumptions. How I then build my neo-realist take, I start from two variants of neo-realism. People have produced several neo-realist versions in their own studies. So I was interested in building one that could explain something about transatlantic relations. I was interested in looking at variants of neo-realism. I have thought about that. Okay, I thought that the two variants that could really offer insights into why transatlantic relations continue to cooperate were balance of power theory. So the first variant, okay, the theory says essentially that states coalesce to balance against power. Okay, so that's the main takeaway from the theory, balance of power theory. There is some empirical evidence for this variant. Okay, so we know that the European Union has sought to develop some level of autonomy from the US after the disappearance of the Soviet threat. And it predicts that if there is an overriding adversary to measure up against, then transatlantic allies will continue to stick together. Okay, so that's the first variant. The second variant that I was interested in for my neo-realist take was hegemonic stability theory, building on the work of people like Kindleberger, Mastanduno, Steve Krasner, Robert Gilpin, plenty of scholars out there. So what it essentially says is that some states, and particularly powerful one, can exercise a level of leadership in world affairs and establish an order that largely reflects their own preferences. There is a degree of empirical evidence for this one as well. The US has been very preoccupied since the end of the Cold War in maintaining hegemony in the international system during unipolarity. I argue in the book that the international system is still unipolar as we speak. So I do not believe that the world has become multipolar, and I do motivate this in the book. And this theory, this variant predicts that the US can afford to pay slightly less attention to the concerns of the Europeans because it is worried about the rise of other great powers, peer competitors. Okay, but despite the fact that it may look like the US may be less interested and less willing to protect the Europeans, they will still need the European allies to deal with rivals as they emerge. So there are two distinct dynamics at play in transatlantic relations following on from this that I believe require explanation and can be part of a neo-realist take on transatlantic relations. Dynamic number one, so how the unipolar power, the United States, handles the rise of peer competitors, China, Russia, and how its second-tier states react. And second, when there is a revisionist behavior in place, such as the Russian one as we speak, how it is dealt with by the unipolar power. Okay? So that's the first dynamic that I try to explain in the book. Okay? So the world has remained unipolar and will remain unipolar for the foreseeable future, I argue in the book, but the unipolar power is extremely worried about future changes in the balance of power. The future, a distant future, which is portrayed as imminent, in which the unipolar power will lose its edge. Under such circumstances, I argue that the dominant power is very interested in overemphasizing the challenge. Okay, it's happening now. We need to do something about it now. That generates a lot of anxiety, okay, about how to handle it. And it generates a lot of anxiety on the part of the unipolar power that is worried about future challenges to its dominance, and a lot of anxiety among the smaller states that worry that the dominant power will no longer protect them if the changes happen in the distribution of power. So the smaller states will have an extra incentive to actually keep the dominant power more rather than less involved in their affairs, which is something that I try to explain as well in the book. The interdependence increases, and because smaller states are pretty much unable to deal with the challenge without the help of the dominant power, they will try to bandwagon, they will try to make sure that everything is done to keep the unipolar power engaged with them. So that's dynamic number one. Dynamic number two, so when a revisionist power really goes all the way and causes disruption, and this is very important to acknowledge, you do not need to be a peer competitor to cause disruption. Okay, so I don't think that Russia can classify as a peer competitor of the US. Nowhere near that level, but it can cause disruption in the eyes, obviously, of the Western world. What the Russian, the intensification of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2022 classifies as revisionist, disruptive behavior by Russia. And under these circumstances, I argue it's important to rally support amongst the allies to contain the challenge. And because second-tier states are very, very dependent on the help of the unipolar power, a sense of solidarity, at least in the short term, and this is clearly explained with what happened in 2022, a strong sense of solidarity is clearly enhanced in order to balance against the threat. So you have alliance continuity and enhanced solidarity. So that's dynamic number two. And I'm gonna take the foot off the gas now a little bit because I do realize that theoretical talk can be a little bit heavy across the board sometimes. And I also realize that I am going towards the conclusion of my allotted time. So I'm going to tell you about the book structure. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 chapters. Okay, actually 9. The introduction as well is not there. Okay, the introduction. So COVID-19 and the Russian-Ukrainian War. So I talk about the response of international relations. That is a contextual chapter. Then I have the chapter that is most dear to me, so to speak, because there was the creative one where I really went all the way into thinking about a neo-realist theory of transatlantic relations. Then I have chapters on the balance of power. So I explain how the world is still unipolar. Then I explain how you have balanced multipolarity in Europe. Then I talk about the basis of American preponderance in Europe. And I conclude, I finish with 3 case studies. So I talk about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. I talk about France and its engagement with Mali. And then by all means, I talk about the consequences of the Russian-Ukrainian war for transatlantic relations. Okay, now just some concluding points for now. I do firmly believe that neo-realism can explain why transatlantic allies remain together. A balance of power explanation why transatlantic allies remain together. And I do believe that continuity, sticking together, primarily depends on balance of power considerations. And finally, it is an asymmetric, it is an unequal relationship. It is destined to remain like that, but as it is, whilst sometimes it is forgotten, it actually brings benefits to both sides as it is. All right. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the commentary and your questions. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was very interesting indeed. Your work seems very bold by bringing back that neo-realist lens. So I'm curious to hear what others' thoughts are on your underdog approach, as you put it. And just to remind people actually in the audience today that if you do have questions or comments for Lorenzo on the book, or indeed any of his research, you'll find the Q&A button at the bottom. You can click there and write anything there. We will come to that in a little bit. So yeah, now we will turn to our expert discussant with us today, Professor Adrian Hyde-Price, for his thoughts and reflections on the book.
Good, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to have read Lorenzo's book, and I'm very pleased he invited me to act as discussant. I think the first thing I'd say is just congratulations on finishing the book. Writing a research monograph is always a great achievement. You develop an argument over many chapters, yet you have to hold a clear red thread throughout to give the book a degree of coherence, which it has. And I think this is a great achievement. You have a very clear theoretical argument. You basically draw on neo-realism, on structural realism, and you also bring an awful lot of empirical data. So if, for example, you're interested in the response of the transatlantic allies to dealing with COVID, or the French experience in Mali, or the withdrawal from Afghanistan, this is the place to look for a lot of very good empirical detail. But I think the use of neo-realism is particularly interesting because, as Lorenzo notes in his conclusion, grand theoretical explanations of transatlantic relations have fallen over the past few decades and never quite took hold in the case of transatlantic relations anyway. And Lorenzo has provided a necessary correction to this lack of a grand theoretical analysis. But as I say, he's also provided a great wealth of empirical data, and your chapters, your 8 substantive chapters, range far and wide over a whole range of different topics. And I would also say this is a timely book because transatlantic relations really are of existential importance to us here in Europe today. And transatlantic relations today are in flux, and the US is led by a president who is very unpredictable and has an idiosyncratic approach to diplomacy and international relations. And as many commentators have suggested, in many respects today, we face the worst crisis in transatlantic relations since Suez in 1956. So this is a very timely book. It is, of course, always difficult when you finish a book. There's always a time when it's at the publishers and you're doing revisions. And of course, history, the current affairs move on. And this is certainly the case with transatlantic relations. And, I was trying to think back. It was, a year ago, we were still wondering, well, who will win the US presidential election? And then we knew that President Trump, or that Donald Trump would be the 47th president. But really from February and particularly March, the pace of events in transatlantic relations has really accelerated as Trump has launched a sort of peace process. He's feted President Putin in Alaska. We had really from many European perspectives, quite shocking treatment of President Zelensky in the Oval Office by Trump and J.D. Vance. And then, of course, we also had J.D. Vance's, again, quite extraordinary and quite shocking comments at the Munich Security Conference. So a lot has happened since you finished the book. But the strength of the book is providing a theoretical perspective on the broader patterns of transatlantic relations. So let's start first of all by looking at the neo-realist theory. And this is what gives the book its coherence and provides the red thread running through the individual chapters. As you say, you identified the 2 main IR or neo-realist theories: balance of power and hegemonic stability theory. I wonder if you might want to say something more about, how compatible these are, because in a sense, balance of power theory says that other states in the system, other great powers in the system, will balance against the dominant power. On the other hand, hegemonic stability theory says that stability and order in the international system comes from one predominant power. So they're both realist theories, but they don't seem, I mean, logically to fit together. I wonder if you might want to comment on that, or perhaps if I run through my comments on the theory first, then you can come back. But the second thing I'd say is that neo-realism at its core is very simple. You outline these 5 key assumptions, but at the end of the day, neo-realism rests on one variable: relative power capabilities. The whole theory, or multiple theories, to be honest, that arise from that within the family of neo-realist theories, arise from an analysis of the implications of this one variable, because neo-realism assumes that all states are the same, they're functionally similar, they're unitary actors, they are the key actors in the system as well. They're primarily motivated by their survival. And the only thing that distinguishes them is the different relative power capabilities. So, I mean, neo-realism ignores differences between states, societies, economic systems, and it doesn't concern itself with history or culture. It seeks to explain broad trends. It seeks to explain recurrent patterns of behavior. And I think this is what you bring out in your analysis, that there is a recurrent pattern of behavior in transatlantic relations, which is that the United States has traditionally been the security provider for Europe, and the European allies sort of basically rally around, or in your words, bandwagon around around the United States. But given its theoretical premise, neo-realism can't explain foreign policy behavior. And if we want to understand shifts in transatlantic relations, don't we need also to explain specific foreign policy behavior? So I suppose my other question is, I mean, neo-realism's great strength is its parsimony. As you say, it focuses on a few key variables. Well, basically, it focuses on one: relative power capabilities. And this gives it its strength as a theoretical explanation of recurrent patterns of behavior. But its parsimony is also its great weakness, which is why it can't explain specific foreign policy decisions. And this is why many realists turn to complementary approaches. For example, neoclassical realists would say you need to look at the interaction of domestic politics and international structural pressures in the international system. And I was very struck by your bold claim that you don't water down realism or neo-realism, and I generally applaud that. But I do think one need not water down neo-realism, but one perhaps needs to think of how it can be developed and how it can be fine-tuned. I don't know if I've spoken already for a while. I know I meant to speak and then you comment, but do you want to come back immediately, Lorenzo, on that?
Don't worry, Adrian. Please
Or shall
finish.
I press on?
You are the star at the end of the day,
Okay.
so
Well,
please finish.
I think you're the star. I'm the supporting act. But let me continue then, because I thought what was interesting in your book is that you suggest that an important role for fear and anxiety, in other words, subjective emotions. And you also make reference to, in pursuing this, you make reference to Thomas Hobbes. Now, it seems to me that maybe this is an area that might be worth pursuing, developing. And I know that, I mean, there are realist theorists who have sought to develop a sort of realist theory of fear, for example. And in doing so, I mean, you could also draw on a much richer realist tradition than just neo-realism. So there's a whole, I mean, what's generally called classical realism has all sorts of sort of insights and theoretical and conceptual resources you could draw on, which wouldn't necessarily, I think, water down a neo-realist approach. It would develop it, maybe make it more useful, more fine-grained in terms of explaining events that somehow don't fit into broad recurrent patterns of events, which is what neo-realism is very good at explaining. So that would be my first point on the theory. I will go through. The second would be on the claim about unipolarity. And this was, of course, the argument that was made, and a very compelling argument in the 1990s, that the US was the unipolar hegemon. There were some scholars who suggested that this was going to be a unipolar age. I would last for decades or generations. Others have subsequently suggested maybe we have had a unipolar moment, but that is eroding. Now, where we are exactly between unipolarity and multipolarity, I think can be debated and discussed, but it does seem to me that what is clear is that the relative power of the United States is declining, and the relative power of, in particular, China is increasing. So we have here a classic relationship that was explored by, I mean, the father of realism, Thucydides, when he looked at the Peloponnesian Wars, and he explained them by pointing to the concern that Sparta had about the rise of Athenian power, and the argument that basically the Peloponnesian Wars occurred because Sparta was worried about the rising challenge from Athens. Now, Graham Allison, as you know, has written a book, explicitly on the Thucydides trap, as he calls it, because many people would say that if you look at the broader patterns of global politics, what is the defining cleavage in the global system is that between the United States and China. We might not yet be in a bipolar system, but quite clearly, the United States is very concerned. One might say it feels fear, certainly anxiety, about a rising China. And this has been something that actually emerged first in the first Trump administration, and then was continued by Biden, and seems to be being continued by Trump. So what we have then is an international system that is in flux. As I say, I would suggest that rather than simply defining the international system as unipolar today, we need to recognize, or I would suggest we should be open to the idea that it is actually becoming more multipolar. And the United States is perhaps what in terms of the British Constitution would be called primus inter pares. In other words, first among equals. So it's the dominant power by any criteria, economic, military, diplomatically, but it's perhaps not enjoying the same position of being the unipolar hegemon that it did certainly in the 1990s. So that would be second question I'd have on this with unipolarity. And then I think you are certainly correct in pointing to the way that Putin's invasion, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 brought the United States and Europe closer together. We saw an unprecedented period after the start of Putin's special military operation, this brutal invasion of Ukraine, where we had unprecedented transatlantic harmony, cooperation between the United States and Europe and the EU, and actually cooperation between the UK and the EU. The first time really there was this warmth and close cooperation after Brexit. So it really did bring together the all transatlantic partners. But what we saw already after the first year was in the United States growing domestic political opposition in Congress to this to Biden's support for Ukraine. And what we see today is the United States pursuing a policy towards Russia and towards the Ukraine war, which basically hits at the vital existential security interests of Europe. And I think I did some interviews I was looking at German foreign policy just recently, and I did some interviews in Berlin back in, when was that, April, May. And in the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they said, of course, when we knew Trump was coming to power, we had we did a lot of scenario planning, a lot of game planning. What might this mean for Ukraine? What might this mean for European security? What might this mean for NATO? But they said we were not prepared and we did not expect the pace of rapprochement between the Trump administration and Russia. How quickly Putin would move, Trump would move to embrace Putin and to distance himself from Ukraine. I mean, almost blaming Zelensky for the Russian invasion of his country and saying very positive things about Russia and about Vladimir Putin. And I think it was in February, it was the first shock for Europeans when there was a UN General Assembly motion on the anniversary of the Russian invasion, condemning that invasion, and the United States abstained. And we subsequently saw this shocking treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office. We have seen we've seen Trump do what Trump likes to do, this very transactional deal-making approach, but at the expense of Ukraine, at the expense of Europe's fundamental security interests, and seeking some sort of rapprochement with the Putin regime and with Russia. Now, it seems to me that's very hard to explain using neo-realist theory. I mean, the balance of power hadn't shifted, the relative power capabilities of the various key actors hadn't changed from Biden to Trump. What had changed was the leader of the United States and therefore domestic politics. So it seems to me that whilst neo-realism can perhaps explain a great deal, it can't explain everything. And perhaps neo-realism would have, has real problems explaining the Trump administration's approach to transatlantic relations, Russia, its broader foreign policy. So those would be my questions. Sort of, in a sense, like the last one is perhaps slightly unfair. This is everything that's happened since the end of, since you finished writing your book, it still seems to me demands that those of us who see ourselves as working within the realist tradition try to explain this theoretically. So with that, I'll finish and pass over to you, Lorenzo.
Please,
Do I have a few minutes to respond, or
yes,
should we
please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was very comprehensive, and I believe it says a lot in terms of trying to stimulate debate on transatlantic relations. And I do believe that you have touched upon a lot of really important talking points about neo-realism and transatlantic relations. And by all means, the aim was exactly this, to try to bring back this level of debate to the issue. One should say that the common challenge when writing a book on such a timely topic that changes every day is the issue of relevance. And you have correctly pointed out that so much has happened. I do have some considerations in the book on the prospect of a Trump administration. And in fact, when I completed the book, I think I had a deadline in December 2024, so I already knew that Trump had won, and there was some anticipation of the type of approach that he would bring to transatlantic relations. And by all means, he has pursued a certain type of approach, particularly involving the Russian-Ukrainian war, which was slightly different from a certain point of view to the one of his predecessor, but on matters of transatlantic relations, essentially pushing for the same level of work in the transatlantic relationship, because the US remains the dominant power in the relationship and is trying to push the Europeans to do more in the relationship. Under Biden, we had the emphasis on the common enemy, the Russian threat. So we all have to work together to counter what Russia is doing. Under Trump, we have a similar aim of getting the Europeans to work together, because if I am not able now to conclude and bring the parties to end the conflict, then the Europeans will be on their own to deal with Russia. The aim, if you think about it, is substantially similar. The way of doing it, the way of achieving it might be different, and in many ways it is, but the hierarchical nature of the relationship is particularly prevalent across both presidencies, and is likely to remain like that, depending, and it does not depend on who is in charge in the White House. And I do believe that this can be explained by my neo-realist approach, which I do believe will have some shelf life beyond who is in the White House, but I do recognize it's a perfectly debatable point. I would also like to say a little bit about parsimony. Yes, I completely take your point there, and this is not a book on individual foreign policy of the states. It's a book on the transatlantic relations. And so I take a much broader approach. I want to explain the dynamic at play in transatlantic relations and how that plays out, and how then it has an effect on why transatlantic allies continue to stick together. And that very much depends on the level of inequality in the relationship. I think there's a lot of work to be done on unipolarity, multipolarity. There is a debate out there, and it's a very fruitful one. And for analytical purposes, beyond my personal conviction, we had to keep that as it was, and unipolarity. I do believe that unipolarity is still there. We have had different moments of unipolarity, and I do believe in the first unipolar moment, the United States was very much unmatched and could overextend its power and fight wars of choice. It can do that much less in the other unipolar moment that we have now, in which the United States is still, by all means, the most powerful state in the system, militarily, economically, perhaps even in terms of soft power, but it has to deal with a greater level of disruption, and you do not need to be a peer to be disruptive, and that has got a lot of importance in the unipolar moment that we live now. So I do talk about different unipolar moments in the book, but I do believe that the world has pretty much remained unipolar since the end of the Cold War, for analytical purposes, but also for personal conviction.
Well, thank you both, Lorenzo, for your presentation, and Adrian for your insights and excellent questions as well. We have time for a couple of questions which have come through the chat from the audience. You're welcome to both read them, otherwise I'll read them out loud, and feel free to respond, either of you, as you wish. So the first question we have, kind of multiple questions, given that the book highlights Europe's continued dependence on the US for security, how does the neo-realist framework account for recent EU initiatives towards strategic autonomy, such as PESCO or the European Defence Fund? Are these seen as mere symbolic steps, or could they eventually reduce reliance on Washington despite the current Ukraine war context?
Thank you so much. A great question. I have studied that quite a lot, and I talk about that in the book and in previous publications as well. They are not symbolic as such. They are important, and particularly the PESCO one in 2017 was very strong and received very strongly, because it came straight after the decision of the UK to leave the European Union with the Brexit referendum of 2016. So they are more than being symbolic, but they do not go nowhere near enough as to reduce dependency of the EU on the United States for hard security. And in the context of the war in between Russia and Ukraine, any security guarantee that does not have a US shield for the moment is likely to be fairly inconsequential. I think that.
Great, thank you very much. And the other question we have, well, first of all, in capitals, thank you for the excellent presentation. This person has a question. The book says it discusses Afghanistan and Mali as additional cases, which you have not mentioned so much in today's presentation. To what extent do these examples reinforce the central argument of enduring US primacy in transatlantic security?
I did say at the beginning of the presentation, I'm not going to tell you everything. I would kind of like people to read the book, but if I can tell you just in a few seconds, I'm going to say that they are really important case studies. So the one in Afghanistan, because it tells us a lot about how the decision by the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan and to execute the decision in a rather strong fashion in August 2021. That tells us a lot about how the European states then had to play the role of followers of a decision that they did not agree with, and they did not necessarily agree, especially with the fact that the consultation had been quite artificial, but they had to go along with that. And Mali, very important, very interesting work there in terms of how the transatlantic allies deal with ventures outside of Europe, particularly for countries such as France, that has always considered Africa, and in particular that area of Africa, as a very important zone of influence, and withdrawing from it without US backing and without the guarantee of US involvement, and France pretty much having to face reality in a very hard way, and therefore France then having to withdraw from areas of interest. And at the same time, France since then has actually played more and more the role of a faithful transatlantic ally and bringing attention back to Europe for France as well. So I think that says a lot about US primacy as well in transatlantic security in the analysis that I have carried out, but feel free to disagree, of course.
Well, thank you. Well, huge thanks to both of you for making today's session possible. We've really enjoyed learning from you both. What an interesting conversation to have been a part of. And well, if anyone at home would like to rewatch parts or share it with colleagues and peers they know would also find this interesting, please do. It will be on our website and YouTube by the end of the week. So along with the link to the book, we'll make sure that's
very kind of you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, thank you again. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody. And yes, we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.